And we are live. Well, welcome to another episode of the Reintroduction Podcast. I am your host, Chris Estefanos, and I'm here with my co-host, Mina Sawiris.
Hi, hi.
How are you all doing tonight? We hope that you are coming into this episode feeling like you are eager to become more content because we have a great friend with us, one that has inspired both Mina and I in so many ways. And I'll let Mina do the intro, but I'm really excited, more because I'm excited to learn from Mariam because she is a baller. So I will let you, Mina, do the intro, share with us how amazing Mariam is, and I'm looking forward for all of those who are listening to benefit from this episode.
Before I get to Mariam, Chris, do you know that you've started every single episode this season by saying "Well, welcome" to the
I
reintroduction?
I know, but it's just part of my like flow of I feel comfortable. And I say all right or well, welcome. It's just part of how I feel comfortable.
Of course.
I like routine. Doing
I
the
want
same.
I want to start one of these episodes one time by just an abrupt start. Be like, Mariam, tell us about your life. Just like get right into it. But
Maybe Chris has a value around consistency.
that's
Hey,
true.
hey, thank you, Marion, for backing me up on this because Mina's bullying me right now.
Value for sure, but it's okay. I'll let it go. But guys, okay, I'm gonna resist the temptation today by telling you that we have a stellar episode for you. But I'll begin by telling you that we've been talking about a whole lot of stuff that have to do with humanity and being fully alive and being fully human. Today, we're going to wrap this up by talking about one of the biggest pursuits of life. We even talk about it a lot in America when we talk about the pursuit of happiness because it alludes to something more, but we want to take it a step beyond happiness even. It relates a lot to what we deal with on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. It relates in the small things and it relates in the big life questions. Being content. How do I feel satisfied and full? And because Chris and myself are nowhere near equipped to even talk about this, we brought someone with us today who definitely can. And it's our dear friend, a long life friend, Mariam Kaldas. So let me tell you a little bit about Mariam for a little bit. She's a double major when she graduated from University of Virginia in religious studies and sociology. Okay, and she got her master's in education. Then she was actually a public relations manager for the Coptic Church in Zambia when she dealt with a lot of on the ground projects. And when she came back, she became the associate director of the Franciscan Mission Service, where she worked with volunteers who are working overseas and how to equip them. Then she worked as an engagement advisor in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs for the U.S. Department of State. And she just now wraps it up by just being a life coach and telling people how to, find purpose in their life. So no big deal. She just has a few things here and there. So Mariam, thank you for joining us on this really awesome, special, and heartwarming episode.
But Mina, hold on, Mariam, why are you so basic? Can you just tell us that?
Yeah, for real.
I just just like to keep it simple.
We're happy you're here.
Yes, thank you for being
Guys,
here.
thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm gonna start by telling you a story, okay? And it kind of relates to what we're talking about because I like to tell stories. So once upon a time, there was like this rich industrialist guy, and the story, by the way, was in the book called "The Song of the Bird." It's a really nice book. There was this rich industrialist who happened to walk on a beach and saw a fisherman who was kind of sitting by his boat, kind of just drinking some tea and enjoying after a hard day worth of work. And the industrialist says to the fisherman, "Hey, why aren't you out fishing?" And the fisherman says, "Because I've caught enough fish for the day." And the industrialist says, "Well, why don't you go out and catch some more?" And the fisherman says, "Well, what am I going to do with them?" He says, "Well, you could earn more money. With that, you could maybe fix a motor to your boat, and then you could catch more fish, which is going to earn you more money, upgrade your nets, earn you more money, maybe buy two boats, or maybe have a fleet of boats so you can be rich like me." And the fisherman says, "Well, what would I do then?" And the industrialist says, "Then you could really enjoy life." And the fisherman sits back and says, "What do you think I'm doing right now?"
Bada bing, bada boom.
Right? So it alludes to this concept of being content with what you have. And it's something that so many of us miss. And so many of us get early on in life, and it kind of sets the mood and pace for life in general. So tell us when we start even having this conversation, so we can distinguish things um, from their counterparts. Why do we need to talk about contentment, and why do we need to talk about happiness? Where's the place for happiness? Where's the place for contentment, and how do they meet?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because in one of your other podcasts, you mentioned that happiness. And for me, happiness is actually more fickle, more fleeting. And I see contentment as more of that deeper inner freedom that is not necessarily contingent on the events of the day. It's that peace that surpasses all understanding. And for me, it's really finding rest in living that fulfilled life that God has intended for us. And that fulfilled life comes from, and this is where the coaching piece comes in, it comes from living into the values that God has given us, our God-given values.
Okay, so God-given values, um, which is a component that distinguishes just fleeting happiness from contentment, which is supposed to go a little bit more than happiness.
Yeah.
How much more? How much more does it go? Is it just like, a couple more years, a couple more moments, like eternity? Like, what is this? Like, what is this talk about contentment? Because even when we summarize the episode, like, it's something that we often hear about, right? And usually, like, someone has given you advice. You either heard it personally, or like online, or like in a YouTube video, or like from a life coach. Talk about being content, because that's supposed to change your life drastically.
Yeah.
So when we talk about being content, and you said we're going to relate that to values, what does that really mean? Because I don't see it just by just pointing it out. What do they even have to do with each other?
Yeah. For me, the values that, so each of us has a unique set of values. I mean, there's a lot of words floating around there, and we'll send out a list later that has some values on it, but like each of us has, I would say, like a top 5 values that God has given us, he has cultivated in us. And I think that they're the indicator. When we're living into our values, we find the contentment. When we are not, that's where the discontentment comes about. And that's where, for me, it's that deeper layer than happiness. Because I think, your sports team wins a game, you're happy. You have a great meal at a restaurant, you're happy. Whatever, you go out for a walk, you're happy. But like when I'm living into my values of connection, when I'm going to my Bible study and really connecting with the ladies in my neighborhood, when I'm living into that, there's a deeper sense of contentment. It's not just a fleeting happiness. It's something that stays with me despite the challenges that are going on around me.
So based on what you're saying, is it okay to deduce then that happiness can be a product of like a personal act? I can bring happiness to myself, but contentment has more to do with being part of a community, or having some more external factors than just buying like a car, or having a happy meal. Could that be one of the factors? Is that one of the values?
I think that could be, if that was your value, right? So for me, yes, I'll say yes to half of that, and like kind of to the other half. Yes to the half that I think that happiness, a lot of things can determine happiness. I mean, I think you guys talked about the happiness factor. There's studies around happiness. There's like so much around happiness. But the contentment piece, it depends on what your values are, right? It depends on what the monk who's in the monastery in Egypt finds contentment in something totally different than me here in Charleston, South Carolina, and how God has called us to live our lives here. And for you, Mina, in Texas, and for you, Chris, in DC, like we're each, when we find them and we're living into them, that's that's where the contentment lies. What it could do with community, but not everybody has like that value of community necessarily in their top 5. And so that might not be what's needed for them.
So can we define what values are, just so that we can have like a kind of a clearer picture of how we get content based on honoring our values? So what are values?
Is it like moral values? Is that part of it? Or because when you say values, the first thing that usually pops to mind is like morality and right and wrong.
Yeah, and I would differentiate it from morality. Values, it's almost, I would say, what is your principles or standards that how you are operating, what's it's the compass by which you are determining how to live your life, how to make decisions, it's kind of the lens that you're looking through. The values are the lens that you are looking through to journey through life.
So let me help clarify my understanding. So I see this list of values that you kind of shared with us earlier, which we will share, by the way, with our listeners on the website and in a variety of different contexts. But some of the values here are like accountability, efficiency, joy, justice, kindness, knowledge. So I guess, like, how do those values lead you to more contentment?
Yeah. Great.
Like, if I find out today that my value is joy, my value is order, my value is generosity, like, how does that guide me to a place in which I become more content?
Right. So let me actually tell a story, because I feel like
go for it. I love stories.
The story will kind of help illustrate this, and then if it feels like it's not still there, we'll go deeper on it. So when Mark and I were living in the DC area, he was not content.
Mark is your husband.
Mark is my husband. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for the
Who's a wonderful guy.
Amazing guy.
And I'll be honest, I was completely irritated with him for not being content. We had a sweet setup living in DC. We were living rent-free with my mom, who was helping with kids. And we were in one of the best school districts in the nation. And we loved STSA. Everything was great when we were living up in the DC area, in my mind. Like, we had that sweet setup. But I was the one who was guilty of conflating happiness with contentment. So I actually told him that he needed to get happy. I was like, you just need to get happy. I used that phrase. I was like, well, get happy. And he couldn't get happy because living in DC actually wasn't honoring a really deep value he has around familial connectedness. He has a value around being connected to his family, not just like emotionally connected, but like physically connected to his family. And he felt extremely disconnected from them because they were living in Charleston and we were living in DC. And God really worked in my heart to see that and to bring light to that. And so for me, one of the biggest clues in recognizing discontentment is when we have that absence of inner peace. Like, he had an absence of inner peace. And if I'm honest with myself, I had it too, but I was just trying to cover it up with the happy moments, and cover it up with like the superficial, like, logic. But there was a real value that was being trampled on. And when we were able to recognize that was happening, and God opened the doors for us to make the transition down here, it was an opportunity to live into that value. And I mean, there's other dynamics too, but like, that was a big value that was being trampled on for him. And now living here and being connected to his family, like it's been a game changer. Like there's a deep inner knowing and inner peace because we're honoring that value that he has.
Mm.
And a lot of values actually came together with this move. So does that kind of shed a little bit light about how when you identify a value and you're like, oh, wow, this value is not being honored in my life right now. That's what's contributing to my lack of peace. Mm. What's the path to honoring that value? And I'm not always saying it's going to be like a move to somewhere, right? But like, it could be an inner move. Like, you know, there could be a relationship where there's no accountability and you have a deep value around accountability. What do you need to co-create in that relationship so that that relationship honors your values?
Mm. Interesting.
This is really interesting, you know, because
yeah. I have like so many things I want to say.
Yeah, me
go
too.
ahead,
because I don't typically think of it in a way that you've presented it for multiple reasons. Is that one, I sometimes will gravitate towards the thought that contentment is the same for everyone. Like you just need to learn how to be content, right? Something that you learn, right?
Mm.
And then the second thought that comes to mind as you're speaking is that usually I'll associate lack of contentment with being unthankful or ungrateful. And you just like need to be more content, bro. You need to snap out of this mood. You need to do better. And I don't really associate it with like a mismatch of values that I need to like internally reflect on and maybe match them a little bit better on the outside. So that's a very interesting approach to the idea. Chris, what were you thinking?
I mean, I had similar thoughts, right? Like my thing was like to have peace. It's not in a pace, it's not in a place, and it's not in a person, right? Like that's like I always say that mentally. That's like my thing, right? It's not in a pace, it's not in a place, it's not in a person, it's not a profession. It's peace doesn't come from external things; it comes from within, and it kind of emphasizes a little bit on what Mariam is saying is that yes, it comes from within, but when it comes from within, when you are living purposefully and doing that which you know God is calling you to do.
Yes.
So it's not this like external stuff. It's not like you get contentment from a car or from a new house or from all these different things. It's if I, for example, have this house in which I can welcome people into and have them live in community with me and grow with me and share with me. So it's like it's interesting because these are kind of like the loose ends that I had always internally felt like there was something there, but I couldn't articulate it. So this idea of values is really beautiful because I think it puts a word and something for people to discover.
Yes.
Okay. So Mina, what do you think of that?
Yeah, and I keep coming back to the idea of like always banking on the fact that hey, you need to be more grateful when you're seeking contentment, which of course has its place as an idea. But I also think a second question or a second comment or a second piece of advice should always be, well, let's look deeper and see what values that you hold dear to yourself that could help you achieve contentment in a much more readily.
Because in Mark's situation, if I was talking to Mark, I probably would have been that annoying guy that would have been like, dude, it doesn't matter where you live, just be happy. But for him, it doesn't really matter where he lives. It matters that he was close to his family. And that was the value that made him feel like he was living in a more content fashion. So it's interesting. It's about, I think, asking the second question. Like, when somebody says, I'm not feeling like I have contentment or not feeling joy, what's the next question to ask? So, in your experience, Mariam, what's the next question that you often ask people?
Oh, so I would say it even comes up. You presented a lot of good ones. I mostly hear like I feel stuck. I'm out of balance. And the next is, where are you feeling stuck? How are you feeling stuck? Because that's what starts to uncover what's really there. because a lot of times that stuckness or that discontentment is formulated around some sort of story maybe you've made up or you're telling yourself or you're believing that's keeping you away from pursuing that value that God wants you to honor, that God has given you.
I don't know if you guys got where there was like a video circulating on Facebook recently of like this like TV show, the TV host, he goes like around a town asking elderly people easy questions in order to give them like a prize without having like the feeling of, hey, I'm just giving you money. So he would just ask him a question, like I said, what's 2 + 4? And they would say it's 6. He's like, hey, you just won like $1,000 or whatever. And there was one woman, the guy interviewed, it was in Arabic. And he interviewed her and he asked her one of those questions. I don't remember the exact, but it was something that simple. It was like, what's 2 + 6? And then she said 8. And he's like, congratulations, you just won the sum of money. And it was a lot of money. And then she looked at him and she said, no, it's okay. I don't need it. You can give it to someone else who deserves it. And she looked like she's someone who could use the money 100%. And he was like, why? She's like, no, my pension is good. I do well. It's enough for me and my kids. I sincerely don't need the money. And she refused to accept it. And like someone else younger than her, very capable of working. And he was like, if she's not going to take the money, I'll take the money. And the other guy took the money. And like, regardless, he may have like really needed it. But the point is, this woman, to me, as I was watching it, give a real life example, even though she's like has no source of income besides her retirement funds and her pension to sustain her life for her and her kids. And she said, and she got an advance pretty much that is like a total lump sum of money. And she still said, no, as of now, I don't need it. Like, I'm good, bro. Give it to someone else. And I don't know, like how to reach that because I think if someone offered me a sum of money on the street, be like, yeah, sure, I won. God sent me the money.
And that's why, Mina, you should have a conversation with Mariam off of this podcast where she can help you figure that out.
You're right. I do. You're right. But
I'm just playing.
Like let alone when we find like, I don't know, money on the street, right? Like depends on how much money is what you do with it. But you always question, who dropped it? Who else needs money? Whatever. But the point is, it is reachable. Some people do figure this out on Earth. It's not like alien, right? It is possible for real.
Yeah.
Okay, Mariam. So, Mina just said a lot of stuff. And I want to be like that woman too. I'm not going to lie to you. I want to like be able to like genuinely say I don't need it. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's just the story that you said about Mark. How does one recognize discontentment in their life? Like, there's probably people listening to this podcast right now and saying, yeah, I'm just not really feeling happy. You know, how do I recognize it? And what do I need to do in order to kind of realign myself and get back on purpose? Let's start with the first one. How do I recognize it?
How do I recognize it? I would say that first of all, you used the word happy there. And I'm gonna just point that out because I feel like we're looking.
Give it to me.
There may be a lot of things that are going to make us unhappy. And to be honest, there might be moments when we're living into our values and we're not happy, but we are content. And so the challenge there is going to be dig a little deeper. Am I not happy in this moment, but I'm content? Like that, maybe that feeling of gratefulness that Mina was talking about. Am I content, but there's something that's like frustrating me? And if I'm not content, if there's something that's not aligned, like it's that lack of inner peace. It's that lack of inner freedom that's in us that's like should be acting as a compass to say, okay, I need to figure out what's God trying to tell me here? What is that value? What is that value that's not being honored? And what do I need to challenge or change in order to honor it? For me, the first step is really figuring out what those values are for you. Like that's got to be number one. And I wouldn't even just say for me. I have my values. Mark has his values. We have family values. And I have just been realizing that my kids have their own values. Like Boaz is my 6-year-old son, and he has a major value around fairness. And wow, he gets really triggered when that value gets trampled on. And I've noticed Simona, 4, almost 5, she doesn't actually have that same value. Like she doesn't, if things are unfair, like unfair in the kid world, like she doesn't get, her feathers aren't ruffled. But for Boaz, man, that's a big one. So sometimes we have to do some perspective work around that and like kind of bring some different viewpoints. But man, when that gets trampled on, whoo, sparks fly in the house.
So in terms of, for the examples you've given,
yeah.
And I'm definitely going to stop using Mark here as the example, because we've definitely used Mark a lot today. And if he's listening in, Mark, forgive us, please.
Sorry, Mark.
We love you,
man. We love you.
We learn a lot from you.
He knew it was coming.
But so then what you're saying is you don't leave what you're doing and go seek after these values. You bring these values into whatever you are doing on a daily basis.
Oh, yes, 100%. You've nailed it. You know, like these values are literally like are guiding our actions, our decisions, like who we are, because God has given them to us. Like they are in us, and that they're like through the lens with we are operating. And when we're not operating through that lens, that's when that discontentment starts to rumble in us.
So I can still be a pharmacist. I can still be an accountant. I can still be a teacher. I can still be a volunteer. I can be whatever. But when I recognize my own values and function on a daily basis based off of these values, then somehow contentment is going to start slowly to seep into what I do from day to day.
And I would actually say that likely you are one of whatever label that you just put on there. You're probably one of those because because they honor that profession honors your values. Like if you have a value around precision and accountability, maybe you're an accountant because you love that kind of work, and you are living into that work by your profession. And there could be businesses and organizations have values. And when you're in an organization that doesn't jive with your values, there's oftentimes a value clash there. And that really throws you off balance and creates a disruption in the inner peace. So what do you need to do to reconcile that in you in order to bring your value into that place, or bring that value into how you're operating?
Can I ask you a question that might seem obvious? Like the answer might seem so obvious, but I'm not so sure. Can you still employ that same principle if what you're doing on a day-to-day basis is society would consider fundamentally wrong? Like if you're a drug dealer, right? or like you're an arms dealer, right? And you're funding war and weapons and things like that. Do you think you can still bring these values into what you do, or does it still always strike that imbalance because functionally what you're doing in general is hurting someone else? And I use obvious examples to illustrate a point, but obviously within the micro examples of our own day-to-day life, sometimes we are a drug dealer, sometimes we're an arms dealer, sometimes we bring what they suffer from. Not to judge anybody, we have days that are like that.
Yeah. You're bringing an interesting point that I really haven't thought about, but just like we can use our powers for good, we can use our powers for evil, right? Like, so like, yes, I would say like you can be somehow leaning into one of your values in doing ill work. I would say like if you're using them for drug dealing or whatever thing, societal thing, you know, if I am using my value around connection to gossip with all of my neighbors, I don't think the contentment is going to be there, right?
Right. Because
So
then they butt heads against each other, because
yeah,
the values are supposed to, that which are supposed to restore you, are supposed to also restore people around you, that these values are in you purposely for. Like when you say one of your values is justice, then who are you seeking justice for?
yeah,
And if these two
or
things are
integrity or whatever, you know, like I might be honoring that value of connection, but I'm trampling hard on that value of integrity.
right,
And
exactly.
there,
Like,
yeah,
yeah, like a day-to-day example. If I'm a doctor and I'm seeing patients, but I'm constantly like overcharging patients, or like upcoding when I charge the insurance, like there will always be that part in you that will remain unsettled and imbalanced, because even if you try to bring some values in it, the overall product is not in sync.
so I was thinking about the rich young ruler when I was preparing for this, and how he was honoring, he had a value around obedience. He said, all of these I have kept since the beginning. He was obedient. There was a value around obedience that he had.
Who's the rich young ruler? Could you tell us briefly, Mary?
Sure. He's in Mark chapter 10, and he's had great possessions according to the Bible, and I would say that he lacked contentment. And that's why when he comes to Christ and says, how can I have eternal life? And Christ lists off these, you know, do you have this, all these commandments? He's like, yeah. I've had those since my youth. So obedience, check. He's been mastering that value. But when Christ tells him, go sell all you have and come and follow me, he has not, there's something missing. There's a value he hasn't honored. And I would say it's a value of compassion. And he, because he didn't look at all those that were around him and have compassion on them. So he was obedient. That was a great value that he was leaning into, right? But he lacked in the compassion. He wasn't honoring his value of compassion, his value, and therefore he wasn't giving. He wasn't willing to let go. And there's a value clash, and that's what precluded him. That's what took him away sorrowful.
Compassion?
I would say compassion. Maybe there could be something else.
No, I like it. I'm interested. You just got me, you know, like, so this guy's a baller. He's got all this money, and he comes to Christ. He's been super obedient. He's followed all the commandments, and Christ sees that he's clinging really, really heavily onto his money, which a lot of us do. A lot of us, we think that we're lacking, so we're not as generous, right? We think that we're lacking, so we're scared to make great sacrifices. So Christ tells him, hey, forsake all and come follow me. And you're saying that his value that was missing was he lacked compassion?
From the story, I would say it's either compassion, giving, or loving others. And there's St. Basil writes on social justice, and he talks about how the rich young ruler's like loss here is the fact that he failed to love. And that's what's holding him back. And I think that that there was a value there that he just was like shoving down and like not honoring at all. And it was either a value around love or giving or compassion that he just didn't honor at all. And that's when Christ is like, yeah, you've got the obedience down pat, but this is what value you're not honoring.
So God can point out to us throughout our lives, through examples, through friends, guidance, through like life in general. He can point you towards certain values that he has instilled in you that have the power to unlock that contentment in you. And
Yes.
when we are pointed towards it and we choose to walk away from it, then we miss out on achieving contentment and therefore achieving joy.
Yes. I think we're done now.
No, but it's okay.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it points towards is that God leverages the discontentment. God leverages that like kind of that off balance, that stuckness, that lack of peace, or maybe leverages is the wrong word, or allows is maybe a better word, allows it in my mind to open up that place towards the inner peace, the deep knowing, and the contentment.
How do you contrast that with personal ambition? Like when we have like some of us are more ambitious than others and we have goals that we want to reach, and when we don't reach them, we are quote unquote discontent and we feel like we haven't achieved. Could that be also part of our value system, or is that just like general ungratefulness?
So that last piece you said right before you said the general ungratefulness, could that be discontent? Yeah, great. You're discontent. What is God protecting you from that you were pursuing that wasn't going to honor your values? What a great, like, and kind of, this is the perspective shift that I'm talking about. Like in this moment, you're discontent because I had this goal, I didn't achieve it, I'm super bummed. Like, what is God pointing? Like the next question is what is God pointing you towards that he wants you to see, and that he was maybe protecting you from because what you were pursuing was not going to honor the values that he knows are alive in you.
Because we have become, sorry, Chris, I was going to say we have become goal-oriented generally as a society, like everything we are pursuing from goal to goal to goal. And we can tend to forget about, everything else in the mix. Like I need to graduate high school. I need to graduate college. I need to pursue a job. I need to get married. And I have to have children. I need to save for retirement. I need. And I've set all these goals for myself in addition to like whatever I'm just ambitious about in general. And values may take a hit throughout this process. Sorry, Chris, you were going to say something.
No, I was just saying, like, I love what Mariam said about like that disruption that God is doing. Like, because I feel like I remember there was that prayer. I don't remember who prayed it, but it was like, disturb us, O Lord, when we are like too pleased with ourselves, when we have lost our thirst for the waters of life and for living in abundance, for, losing sight of eternity. Like, disturb us, God. Like, let us feel this sense of something is off within us when we're not living according to what you have called us to be and called us to do. Because I do think that discontentment can be a stirring from God, maybe for us to start to think and dig a little bit deeper. And discontentment can also maybe be from the devil as well, when we're not able to live grateful. So I think there's like a little bit of a necessary discernment where all of us need to be asking ourselves of like finding those values. So when we do feel discontent, we're asking ourselves like, or maybe when we are feeling a little bit disturbed, we ask ourselves, where are our values off? Like, where are we maybe stuck because our values aren't being honored? That's really beautiful. I mean, that's a really profound way to approach life, because I think so many of us maybe are walking through life and intrinsically know that we have values around certain things, but can't really articulate them or identify them well.
Yeah. And Mina, even when you were talking about going through these steps of life, oftentimes we find ourselves discontent in going through these steps because we are so channeled in the shoulds. I get very scared of the shoulds. Like the shoulds, for me, we call it in coaching, it has a lot of the inner critic or the saboteur, like a little devil on the shoulder. The shoulds are, anytime you've got a should popping up in your life, it's like go in hard, because that's usually something like some story that you got going on that needs to be worked through. And we we're going through these shoulds of life, the high school, the college, the marriage, the kids, the da, 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 da. And that might not be what God is calling us to. And if we're not taking the time to really discern what our values are, then we're not going down the path of the fulfilled life. Like the fulfilled life is leaning into the values that God has granted us, has given us, and live like and finding them and living into them. And that might not look like that standard trajectory that is valued in society.
Yeah.
Loosely.
So that means, like, as you're saying, so our work ethic can get in the way of our values, our own selfish ambitions sometimes also can get in the way of our values. What about comparison? Like and I think that is probably one of the biggest leading factors, generally speaking, to discontentment, is that I feel like my peers are doing so much better than I am.
Yeah. When we were talking earlier about what are kind of like ways to recognize this discontentment, in my mind was comparison, anxiety, any complaining or murmuring. Those are like great indicators that there's some sort of like discontentment going on, and like we need to dig a little bit deeper and figure out what's going on.
Interesting.
And
yes, go ahead.
And the comparison one, I think, is critical. And I think that any time that we get into that comparison mode, that complaining mode, that anxiety, that asking, do I have enough space, we are pointing ourselves away from contentment.
So, okay, so like you're basically presenting it in an opposite fashion, is that you said comparison is an indicator. It is not like a product of discontentment. It's not just because you're a discontent person and that's why you're comparing yourself to everyone as a result of that. It's the opposite. It's because this is like one of the lights that is saying, hey, you're low on fuel, right? You're comparing yourself to others. Stop and reconcile your values.
Yeah. I would say this is like you're orienting yourself in the wrong direction in that moment. As soon as that, like, do I have enough, or am I like, wow, those houses across the street are looking a lot nicer than my house. Like whatever. That's the moment that you like, whoa, what's going on? Am I? Is where is this coming from? Because chances are it's not coming from your values.
I'm going to make a public confession here based on what you just said. So I remember years ago, I was invited to this like very, very fancy party here in Washington, D.C. And I walked in and I had this like intense feeling of imposter syndrome, that I did not belong in this like very fancy party because I'm not up to par with these like fancy schmoozy people. And I remember the part that really killed me was when I got to the valet line and I went to like put the ticket, and the guy, like, everybody's pulling up with like a Maserati and like all these different things. And then my little Volkswagen Jetta that I used to drive gets pulled up, and I'm like incredibly embarrassed because I'm like, man, Chris, you should have like rented a car and made yourself look good. But this is like, and literally what happened after that night is I went and I bought a nice car. And I started to think about this years later. This is years later, years ago. I started thinking about this years later, like how that sense of feeling discontent or feeling like you're not enough or feeling like I don't really care like what kind of car I drive. It's like nice to drive a nice car, but I don't find my value in the car. But it's really interesting how that moment of like looking around and comparing yourself can really set you off on a really crazy trajectory, because you're always like, all right, and I also need to get a nice house, and I also need to do this, and I also need to do this because I want to keep up with the Joneses. But the reality is that when you start to get those things, and I remember when I got my car, I was like, yeah, this is cool. It doesn't really matter. Like, it's not that big of a deal. And it just started to feel like my Volkswagen again. So it was like again,
that's
public
that fleeting happiness, like that, like you, like that fed straight into the happiness. Like, you, okay, now like that happiness, oh, new car, and then
Yeah, and it's that hedonic treadmill, right? Like
yeah,
that I talked about that a few episodes ago. It's that like the next thing, thinking that it's going to give you joy, thinking that it's going to give you contentment, but in reality, it doesn't. Um, but it's so interesting how like, and nobody on this podcast judge me. I know a lot of you have fallen into this trap too. So I'm watching you rolling your eyes and judging Chris and saying, what kind of loser does that? Hey, I'm public confession. I'm just saying.
Bro, we all know you're bougie, Chris. Come on,
I
man.
mean, listen.
well, and I would say, wow, what an amazing opportunity that would have been to really dig into where is that discomfort coming from in that moment? Like when you roll up and you're in your Jetta and you feel like that imposter syndrome, like, wow, let's dig in. What's this really about? Like what? Go ahead.
No, let her coach me for a second.
No, go.
Come on. This is a free session, buddy.
What's happening? Like what? And my big question was, what are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of? That's a great question.
My biggest, I know this about myself. My biggest thing is I want always people to feel like they belong. It's like one of the strongest values is including people, having people feel included. So I know when I feel excluded, it really triggers me and does something. But I had to do that digging to understand.
Wow, Chris.
You just named it, Chris.
That's profound.
Like you just like this is it. Like
but what I'm saying is if you're not introspective enough to really identify that, you will really fall by the wayside. And it took me a long time to really like take a moment and say, okay, like why do I always feel this feeling around really schmoozy people? Because it's very exclusive. And it feels like it doesn't include those who may feel like they can't ever belong in this place.
Yes. And you, by being there, it was almost like you weren't honoring one of your values of belonging. And that's where the discomfort was coming from.
Yep.
That's where the discontentment was coming from, because you weren't honoring your value by your very presence there. It wasn't actually imposter syndrome. It was that you weren't honoring the value, such a deeply held value.
So see, I publicly confess so people can benefit from this. So
beautiful. And some people can get to that by themselves through a lot of introspective reflection. Yeah. Some people can't, and they need help, like through like someone who can help them think out loud, whether it's like a father of confession or a friend or a guide or an advisor or a life coach or someone who can kind of help you reach these. But I want to take this a step further because a lot of times the opposite is true. We default, then we say, okay, so I can be content. Then I'm going to say, and I think we're guilty. I'm guilty of doing this a lot. You'll say, thank God it can be worse. Right? And I don't know if that's a good solution, to be honest, because I was thinking about this on my drive home today. And I'll tell you why. Because it's almost like saying to God, thank you for not making it worse, just like it is bad for my brother here next to me. Like basically I'm telling him, thank God I'm not like your other son. I'll be happy. And that's kind of, I feel like that's not cool. Like telling your dad, hey, I should be happy because I'm not like your other son, because someone is most likely going through the worst that you're saying, thank God it's not worse. So I guess, and I asked myself, okay, then what should you be saying?
Yeah.
And then I said this, like I wrote this down, that for me to at least try and try to practice this. And I said, maybe instead of saying, hey, it could be worse, I can say, you and I, speaking to God, you and I are going to make this work. And when we do, it will be epic. It will be the best thing ever. Like it has nothing to do with worse. Like that, like, I'm not just being content because I'm happy it's not worse.
Yeah.
I'm content because this is what will unlock my potential to the greatness that God has wanted for me through him.
Yes. And I would say, Mina, I would even say, what is the real challenge in that? Like, what is like, it could be worse. Like, what's the place that you're in right now that you're feeling is so bad that like that's causing you to say, oh, it could be worse. And like, what's there? What is God revealing in that moment to then have you say that next piece that like, we're going to work together to make this epic? Like, really, like, take some time, explore it in the same way Chris explored that he's got this value around belonging. And that's what's really showing up for him and how he operates. Like, these are the moments that can really help us understand where our values are. These like challenging moments, because they can point towards what is a value that we have that's not being lived into, not being honored in that moment.
It's interesting though, because you know how I discovered that the value of like inclusion was doing a Clifton Strength Finder.
Yep.
Like, was actually doing some self-discovery work. And like, I think one of the key things is God is really, it's really important for us to know thyself. And I think the fathers of the church speaking a lot about knowing thyself.
Yeah.
Right. And I think too often we are so interested in accomplishing rather than knowing ourselves, because we can find so much of what we identify with that which we do versus what we know about ourselves. So I just, maybe Mariam, you can speak to those who are listening about the strength or the beauty of self-discovery, like kind of.
You know, I feel like I have the best job in the world because I get to journey with people on their journey of self-discovery. It's the aha moments are why I do this work. Like, those give me such a high and give my clients such a high. It's just so amazing to witness people connecting the dots about themselves, because it unlocks for them a whole new purview about how they're operating. I mean, it's like, oh, this is why I do this. And this is why I respond this way. And this is why I function. And then it gives them permission to stop trying to be something they're not. Stop trying to act in a way that they're not being called to. And as part of my coaching work, I have folks fill out this discovery questionnaire. And I have so many clients come to me and say that was the hardest thing I've ever answered, because most of us, unless prompted by someone else, don't take the time to do the self-discovery work, because it can be hard. It can be hard work to figure out and to really reflect and understand. And
it can be scary too.
And it can, yes,
it can be scary.
It can be scary. And yet it's the most critical work. It's the most.
What's it like to self-discover with God in the center?
I would say that's probably my favorite kind of self-discovery, because I think it informs it in a whole deeper and more profound way for me. When God is at the center of our self-discovery, it gives meaning to our self-discovery. It's not self-discovery for the sake of like self-enlightenment. It's self-discovery for the sake of how can I more deeply honor God with my life.
And do you think with a person not knowing themselves well, it makes it more difficult for them to know God?
Ooh. I haven't thought about that before, but my inclination in this moment is yes. Yes. Yeah.
Because there's not space to ask for more grace in areas in which they're struggling, or areas in which they want to dig deeper in their values.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
and like I remember that's the whole like self-examination piece. But imagine self-examining with knowing your values, how much more profound that could be, right? Like examining where I was like off kilter today in terms of honoring who God is calling me to be and living according to the values in which he's instilled in me.
Yeah. Think about that in terms of like, you were talking about confessing earlier, in terms of your confession, even like you can use that as a framework. Like, this is how I have not been honoring my values. And this is a confession before you all, like, because I wasn't honoring that value. Like, I knowingly wasn't honoring that value in how I operated or how I acted.
And in repentance, like when you're actually going and evaluating, because we do talk about like self-examination a lot in Orthodox Church.
Yeah.
When you talk about self-examination, you preclude it with values, and you conclude it with God, and you sandwich the three together, then it gives a whole new meaning to like how you approach a day-to-day life.
Yeah.
You've got values, you've got repentance, and you've got God, and you've got contentment all sandwiched in between. Then you're no longer inclined to, like, when someone comes to you for advice, you say, "Hey, do what makes you happy, bro." That's different.
Because that happiness is fleeting, right?
Yeah. And we get stuck in that place a lot, I would say, especially in North America.
So I have one final question.
Mm-hmm.
Can your values change?
This is one I've been reflecting on lately. And I think they become refined, or more that you learn more about them. I think the core of them remain the same, but like the nuances are discovered. So sometimes a modifier word will be put in front of one of your values, like, I don't know, adventurous connector. Like, I like to connect in adventurous ways. Or you learn more about how your value is showing up in yourself and in the world. So, and I would say, like, maybe the top 5 shift a little bit as you grow, right? So maybe you've got a top 10, and the top 5 are in this kind of like shifting place. But and God is always revealing new things to us, right? So maybe there's one that we hadn't discovered before that's there. And that certainly happened to me in my own work with my own coach. Like, she's like, "Oh, I think we just found a new value that's bubbling to the top." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, wow. I don't think I had recognized or realized that one." So I guess the baseline is yes, I guess they can change, because as you discover new ones that maybe you didn't realize you had before.
How do we help ourselves and help our listeners discover what our values are?
So for sure, this worksheet that we're going to post for you, and there are some, I think, a few questions that can help point folks towards, think about a time when you felt that contentment. Think about a time when you were fulfilled. What was around you? Who was around you? What were you doing? What were the elements that were existing in your life? Use that as a starting place to think about how God was present in that moment and what he was speaking into you as your values. Because I think that's a great starting point for what our values might be. And I mean, I'm happy to share other questions that I use with my clients. I call it value mining. And folks can ask them for themselves. They can ask them with their friends, with their partners. They can have conversations. We value mine with I value mine in conversations all the time.
Tell us about the worksheet. How do we use the worksheet?
So with the worksheet, I would say this one will go through the style more of, here's a list of values that exist. And it's an easy way to start, because sometimes people are like, values, I mean, folks have different ways of operating. So look at the list of values, circle, highlight whatever resonates with you. And I'm going to challenge folks to say, don't circle and highlight things that you want. Go for things that you have, right? Not the want, the have. And then from there, I would say, start asking yourself some questions of, how does this define me? Is this who I am at my best? Is this a filter I use to make hard decisions? And then really use this worksheet to work through the questions, because I feel like when you do that, you'll start to understand the breadth of how your values are impacting how you operate in the world.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So, I just have one more question. I said that earlier.
I forgive you.
But tell us about what you think Jesus tells us about contentment.
Yeah.
Because I think we find out who we are in who we are created after.
Mm-hmm.
Hard question. I'm sorry.
No, you know, contentment comes up a few times biblically. It comes up in Job. It comes up in the story of the rich young ruler, which I mentioned earlier in Mark 10. And it comes up again when Paul writes in Philippians. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what to do when I have plenty. And I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And that to me is like, whew. I mean, Paul was a man of some incredible values, and he knew his values inside and out. And that's what gives him the freedom to say that statement.
In prison.
In prison.
St. Paul the Baller.
And in plenty or in want. Like he, just in the same way when he had plenty, he wasn't in that hedonic cycle that you're talking about. Like he had the contentment then, and he had it in prison, because it was so separated from what was around him. It was completely based off of that inner peace, that inner freedom, that inner knowing, that inner living into his values.
So going back to Chris, what something you mentioned early on in the episode is that the only time contentment can be a person is when it comes to God.
Mm.
Yes, that's the whole thing, right?
Right.
Not in a pace, a place, a person, or a profession. It's in the person of Jesus Christ.
Mm.
You only find your sense of contentment in knowing who you are in Christ, in knowing how you were created in his image, and the gifts and the values that he's instilled in you. Now that I've discovered this from Mariam, I've always said when you live according to using the gifts and talents that God has given you, but I think this values is part of the gifts and talents.
Yes. Yeah. And I would say sometimes there's overlay between those.
Yeah. And Anthony Caniaris, one of the Greek Orthodox scholars, he writes and he says, like, we were created for joy. And when we miss it, we miss one of the reasons for existence. So like joy is a natural byproduct of being content. And I mean, the message of the Gospels and the epistles are not short in talking about rejoice. And again, I say to you, rejoice, and rejoice in the Lord always. And I've come so that you may have joy. Like that message is like repeated all throughout, even in like small little examples. When you talk about Luke chapter 15, the three stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son, like all of it is about, like, look at how each of them celebrated after whatever was lost was restored again. And that celebration was more, in a worldly sense, was more costly than what they lost to begin with. Some could argue that like the coin that was lost and the woman was able to find, the party that she threw after was more expensive than the coin she lost itself. But that gave her like that sense of joy, because it isn't about the material. well-being. It goes beyond that to back to St. Paul's words that you had just mentioned a few minutes ago, Miriam. So I think it is a great thing to focus on, and also how that translates. A lot of times we say wait until you feel something, and then that's going to help you act. But then sometimes you act, and it helps you feel. Right? There's a story of like a choir leader. Yeah, they were singing like Easter songs of like joyful jubilations of Easter and resurrection, and and the choir director asks them, is like, hey, he asked the choir, he's like, are you happy? And he said, yes. And he said, well, I suggest you notify your faces, because they didn't look happy when they were singing, and they didn't look like they're experiencing joy. So sometimes like, and I remember there was like in some exchanges of diaries between like one of the church fathers and one of the nuns, he says like, smile even when you don't feel it, like force it, because that's going to help you
Mhm.
transmit joy to others and help you feel it in exchange. So sometimes getting up and doing a thing will create the feeling we're looking for in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Miriam, closing thoughts. We've been going for a while.
Yeah. No,
This was fantastic.
no, this was amazing. I really appreciate both of you so much here and really allowing me to dig deeper on this topic, because it's just one that I am so passionate about. And I would say my closing thoughts are: do the work, find your values, take the time to self-examine, take the time, because this is what will unlock the inner freedom, the inner peace, the true fulfillment, the true contentment. This is what this is the key. I'm giving you the key.
Nina.
Amen to that. I spoke a lot today, so I don't want to close off with a rant.
Keep it
But
brief, man. Keep it brief. Keep it brief.
like I'll say to God, hey, like help me, help you, help me. Like there is just that exchange of like back and forth. Help me find my values that are grounded in you, that you've given me in the first place, so that I enjoy life with you. Help me use that to restore others around you and around me. And help me finally walk into my entire life, so that when I'm on my deathbed, and this is one of my biggest personal fears, is that I'd look back on my life and be like, dang, that was a waste. Like, help me be content in the process. Help me be content in my small things, in the daily decisions. Help me be content in the big life transforming decisions, so that in every little step I'm walking with you. Help me understand that contentment is not what I do, it's the means of which I do things by. It's like the gloves I wear, it's the shoes I wear to do everything that I do on a daily basis, so that I can be honest and faithful in what you've given me for the sake of others.
Mm.
Mean.
Amen. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that, but I just thank God dearly for his sweetness in how he's constantly pursuing us through giving us conversations like this, where he is sort of encouraging us to know ourselves more in order to know him.
Yeah.
And I finish off this conversation with telling all our listeners, hey, if you've tuned in right now, rewind. Rewind, go back to the beginning of this episode. It's going to be finished and you can rewind, but just make sure you listen through this. Not because Mina and I said anything, but Mariam was a baller tonight.
Liar.
But we really just encourage you guys to, we'll post this sheet on Reintroduction Podcast website underneath the episode. We'll also try to put it in the podcast notes for those who listen. And we will also try to post it in Facebook under the video in order for you to have access to it.
And if you have any questions on this topic, please direct them to Mariam. If you have any questions for Mariam, also direct them to Mariam.
Yeah.
And you can find her at mariamkaldas.com. She has a lot of insight. She is a transformative person, and she's easy to talk to. She'll help you think about a lot of deep things that you don't even know you needed to think about.
Yes, and I do want to finally say one final thing, that we did we did start each title of the episode with "Hey Man," and we referred this as "Hey Mankind." But I do want to highlight all the amazing female voices that we have within our community, and how inspiring and how amazing they are, and how their voices are so incredible in encouraging the body of Christ and those who are outside of the body of Christ and are listening to this podcast. We are really privileged to have amazing women in this world
Amen.
that really are lifting up our souls, our minds, and our spirits. And we're just honored to be two dudes that get to learn from the amazing women in this world. So
Amen to
kudos
that.
to Mariam for her amazing just elevation of the voice of the all the amazing women in the world that we have. So thank you, Mariam, for being on tonight. God bless you. And for all those who are listening, you can find this podcast on a variety of podcast platforms: iTunes, Spotify. You can watch it on YouTube. You can ask Alexa to play it. But with that being said, we leave you with the peace and grace and love of God, and have a wonderful night. God bless you all.
Peace.
Guys.